I'll be speaking with Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett about the age-old question of what is an emotion. Dr. Barrett is a distinguished professor of psychology at Northeastern University, where she directs the Interdisciplinary Affective Science Laboratory, and is also the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Emotion Review. Dr. Barrett is an internationally renowned expert on the nature of emotion and has authored more than 150 papers and chapters on emotion and emotion regulation. She's received numerous rewards for this work. This includes the NIH Director's Pioneer Award and the Career Trajectory Award from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology. So I'm going to now turn to our experts in emotion interview with Dr. Barrett on what is an emotion. Thank you for speaking with us today, Lisa, and welcome.
Thank you so much.
So one of the things I wanted to start out asking you a bit about is sort of your journey into the field of emotion in the first place. So where did things first get started for you to begin to want to study and devote your life to emotion in the first place?
Well, I actually started in graduate school studying a completely different phenomenon. Doesn't really matter what it was. The point is that as part of these experiments, I had to measure people's emotional feelings. And I noticed that some people were very good at distinguishing what we believe to be distinct states, that anger, sadness, fear, disgust feel very different. They look like they have very different body manifestations and so on. And indeed, some people are very good at distinguishing between those states. Other people use words like angry, sad, disgusted, but they use them in such a way as to indicate that they're not really experiencing distinct feelings. They're really using those words for what they have in common, which is they indicate an unpleasant feeling. And so in a very simplistic way, I thought, well, it would be really interesting to measure how well people distinguish between different emotional states. Then you could ask them about what they experience, and then you can figure out who's accurate and who's not, and then it would be easy from there to figure out how to make people more accurate about what they feel. So I thought, okay, it's just a simple matter of finding what are the objective ways to measure when someone is angry or objectively measure when they're sad. And I started a literature search in the scientific literature to find out what the markers were, and didn't find them. And I just systematically, I thought, well, everybody knows people make different facial expressions when they're angry versus when they're sad. So facial expressions would probably be a great way to measure when someone objectively is in a kind of emotional state. And I reviewed the literature, and what I found was that perceivers are good at judging under certain conditions, judging expressions in the face. But when you actually measure facial muscle movements, they don't actually indicate very well whether somebody's angry or sad or afraid. They certainly indicate whether someone is feeling pleasant or unpleasant. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe the face has a lot of muscles in it, and we can only measure 6 or 7 at a time, maybe 12 at best. So probably there's just a lack of precision on the measurement end. So there must be some other way. What about the body? We all know that there are different cardiovascular states for emotion, right? So your heart races in fear, your blood pressure goes up in anger. That would maybe be a good way to measure what emotional state someone is in. But then when you look at the literature, it turns out there aren't really cardiovascular markers for each emotion. And so I just systematically went through the literature and I couldn't find any objective markers. And I thought, well, this is a puzzle. It's a really interesting puzzle. How is it that you can have feelings that are so clearly different? How is it that you can look at someone and make a pretty decent guess about whether they're angry or sad or afraid, but that scientists can't objectively define when someone is angry or afraid or sad? And I thought this was an interesting puzzle, and that's what I've spent a lot of my time studying.
And so that's exactly what I want to ask you a bit about. Is this puzzle, what is an emotion? How do we define it, in the first place? And I mean, it's interesting because, like you say, I mean, we can all relate to this experience of emotion in our lives, and to some extent, we're pretty good at picking up, on emotions in other people. Yet, why we have such a hard time as scientists defining emotion is this really interesting kind of thorny issue and puzzle in our field. And you've taken this amazing approach to provide an illuminating perspective on exactly understanding, what is emotion? What is sort of the core fundamental, nature of it? And I wondered if you could elaborate a bit on this sort of, psychological, constructionist approach you've taken in terms of what are the key principles that this approach holds for defining what an emotion is.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, just by way of context, I'll say this, that in science, if you look at any scientific discipline, most scientists start with, most sciences start with the idea that perceptions reveal the way things work. So, if you look at, in astronomy, for example, if you stand in one place and you watch the sun rise in the east and move across the horizon and set in the west, this led people to believe that, in fact, the sun revolves around the earth, because that's what our perceptions reveal to us, right? If you look at, for example, when Aristotle was trying to understand the basic elements of the universe, he thought they were, earth and water and air and fire, because that's what he has access to through his perceptions. And then, of course, let's take Aristotle as a really good example. We now know, of course, those aren't the basic elements of the universe. In the 20th century, physicists talked about atoms, and then they broke atoms into parts, like electrons and protons and neutrons, and then they broke those into parts. We had quarks and leptons and subatomic particles, and then those got broken into parts, which now basically are, I think it's, we have everything is made of little strings vibrating in 11 dimensions or something, right? But the idea was you always start with your perceptions and then you break them down into their more elemental components, and you try to understand how those elemental components build the perception that you have. That's really what psychological construction does. So in the field of emotion, we started with the idea that anger is an element. It's an elemental building block of the mind. You're born with an anger circuit in your brain. You make an expression or what have you. You have a cardiovascular pattern when you're angry. And so there's an individual causal mechanism that produces this elemental, what we would call psychologically primitive state. That is, you can't break it down into anything more basic. And I think we've taken the approach to say, well, we think emotions are not basic in this elemental way, that they themselves are actually the product of a set of more basic operations. So to use another analogy, we would say, for example, you can take a bunch of ingredients like flour, water, salt, sugar, and you can make something out of them, like bread. Or you could make something else out of them, like a sauce. The ingredients, you wouldn't say flour is an ingredient that's specific for bread, because you can do a lot of things with flour, right? You wouldn't say that an oven is a mechanism for baking bread. It is a mechanism for cooking a lot of things. And so very similarly, we use behavioral methods and also brain imaging methods to try to identify, well, what are the basic ingredients of the mind? What are the basic operations of the brain? How do they construct what you and I feel as very elemental experiences, but actually from a causal standpoint, maybe they emerge from these more basic elements. And maybe emotions not so different, from, say, cognitions and perceptions of the world. Maybe the same ingredients or very similar ones are being engaged every time we have a mental state. It's the configuration or the recipe maybe that differs.
And how do you think this particular approach, which, you outline in such amazing detail, and I always love the metaphor of, cooking in the oven and the ingredients. I think it helps illuminate it for a lot of people who are just trying to come to terms with what an emotion is, for the first time. How do you think this approach differs maybe from other perspectives on what an emotion is that are out there in the field right now?
Yeah, so I think you can group together maybe. There are a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different approaches, but I think you can kind of group them together. I think you can say, well, there are a group of theoretical perspectives that say emotions are elemental. Each emotion has its own mechanism. And so there's a mechanism for anger, and that when the mechanism is triggered, anger erupts. And every instance of anger might not look identical, but it kind of looks similar because they're all caused by, a single common cause. That's really what's called the basic emotion approach, I think. And you can find differences in different approaches that are basic emotion approaches, but they all kind of have that flavor. Then you've got appraisal approaches, which say, well, these elemental experiences these elemental states don't just erupt like a reflex. Actually, you as the perceiver, you have to impart meaning to the situation or to the stimulus in order for emotion to occur. So really, it's not so much that emotions are triggered as much as you engage in a meaning analysis of the world. You figure out what the world means, what the stimulation means, and then you might respond with emotion. They're pretty much appraisal models. That's what they're called. I'm really glossing over a lot of variation in these models, and it turns out that even in the appraisal domain, there are some very meaningful distinctions I'm not really talking about here. But in both of those views, I think emotions are still considered to be very distinct states from one another. Anger and sadness and fear, very different. It's assumed that the responses are similar within a category. So not every instance of sadness looks the same, but they're kind of more similar to each other, maybe, than, an instance of sadness is to an instance of anger, let's say. And the assumption is also that the mechanisms are domain specific. That is, whatever the mechanisms are for emotions, they're only for emotions, and they're really not so much for cognitions or for perceptions. I think from our perspective, we would say emotions are perceptions. That you are either, you as the perceiver, every waking moment of your life, right now, for example, you and I are talking to each other, and you are tracking exteroceptively what's going on for you right now. You're listening to my voice, you're seeing my face move in certain ways, or my hands, and so on. Unbeknownst to you, you also, because you're probably not paying attention to it, but your body is at a certain temperature. You can probably feel the chair against the bottom of your legs. If you pay attention to it, you direct your attention there, you can feel that pressure there. And your brain is also recording interoceptively everything that's going on in your body, even if you aren't aware of every little detail of those sensations. So you can think of it as you have a moment of sensation coming partly from your body and partly from the world, and you as the perceiver have to make sense of those sensations. And you do. You sometimes create perceptions of the world. You sometimes create perceptions of your body, which is typically what we refer to as emotion in a colloquial sense. And when you make sense of those sensations, you're drawing on information that you have stored from the past. It's fairly well known that without such information from the past, you cannot make sense of sensations in the present. And so from our perspective, emotions are not special. They are mental states that are caused pretty much like every other mental state, using a set of basic operations that are not special for emotion.
So it's really helpful, in thinking about what emotions are. And I wonder, though, how do you think about emotions as being distinct from this closely related construct people think of as emotion regulation? How different is that really from an emotion itself and the experience of it?
Well, I think that the concept of emotion regulation is yoked very much to the concept of emotion. So you have to have an idea of what you think an emotion is, right? In order to be able to regulate it or control it or modify it in some way. So I think if your view is that an emotion is a special kind of state, you know, that is produced by a special mechanism, then you have other mechanisms that come in after the emotion is manifest, or maybe slightly just before, to control its expression. But if you believe that emotions are perceptions of a sensory array, and that you're always constructing those perceptions in a moment-to-moment sense, then modifying your emotional state really has something to do with modifying how you're constructing meaning of those sensations. And so emotion generation and emotion regulation becomes a subjective distinction instead of a mechanistic distinction. So really, it would be the same mechanisms that you would be interested in, not different ones.
That's helpful. I mean, and when we think about, emotion and emotion regulation, part of these, constructs involves often emotion expressions. And one thing that you've done recently that I was really excited about, and I know a lot of people listening to this as well will be, is, you've published this paper suggesting that maybe Darwin, may have actually been wrong about the expression, of emotions as these kind of biologically based, anatomically fixed entities that are readily detected in the face, right? And instead you sort of provide this novel perspective that centrally features the role of context, both in expressing and interpreting emotions in other people. And I wonder if you could explain this in a sense in which Darwin, he had a lot of great things, but maybe on this one it wasn't quite right, in terms of the fact that expressions may not always be reflecting our internal states.
I think Darwin, I mean, it's very daunting to anything critical about Darwin.
Yeah.
And I also want to say that um, well, there's a lot to say here. I'll just say this. Sometimes the view that emotions are these biologically basic events with their own separate mechanisms is considered to be an evolutionary view. And then a construction view is somehow considered to be a cultural view that is not evolutionary. And so not in any, I really believe in evolution as much as anybody. And I think what I'm suggesting is that there are different processes that have evolved, really. That certainly the architecture of the mind is subjected to selection pressures, but maybe what evolved is somewhat different. I think with Darwin specifically, though, I would say, you have to consider the context in which someone is writing. And so, for example, you look at, On the Origin of Species, Darwin made this remarkable proposition, which is that, before Darwin, there was this view that species were platonic, that there was a perfect form for each species that was handed down by God, basically. And that variations that you would see in instances of a species were error. They were like mistakes, really, because there was a pure form. That's very similar to the idea that there are pure forms of emotion, and that any variation that you see has something to do with something other than emotion. It's not really. But so Darwin had this view that actually the variation across instances within a category are meaningful. They are meaningfully tied to the context. That's why you get variation in a species, right? And so then you have to ask yourself, well, then why would he write a book later that essentially kind of almost reverts back to what looks like a pre-Darwinian view of emotion? Because his model of species and the meaningfulness of the variation doesn't really match this book that he wrote. And I think you have to understand why he wrote the book. He was trying to make the point, not that expressions are functional, he was trying to make the point that emotions are like tailbones. They're vestigial. They're evidence of evolution because here we have evidence of these expressions that are not useful anymore, but yet we still see evidence of them. And so isn't this just evidence that we evolved from, that humans, evolved from other creatures? Because we have these vestigial things. We have a tailbone, that's vestigial. There are lots of things we have that are vestigial. Emotional expressions, those are vestigial also. I mean, that's a bit of a caricature of Darwin in a sense, because he also said a lot of other really interesting things. He also said some crazy things. I mean, he suffered a little bit from the representativeness heuristic. He thought that anxious people had frizzy hair, and also, again, remember that, at the beginning of a science, scientists use their perceptions, as evidence of how the world works. So I, um, and there are other things in that book, I think, which are interesting too, like the mechanism he proposes for how expressions came to be paired with emotions was Lamarckian, not natural selection as he, described it about species. So there are all these things, I guess, in the book, and I think that what's happened really is that modern researchers always look back to historical figures, and they pull what's useful to them from those historical texts. And so certain people have written about Darwin as if he's saying that expressions are these functional movements that are tightly linked to a person's internal state. And I think that the research, so my point is really that Darwin said a lot of things. But the research shows, I think, pretty clearly that although we as perceivers pay attention to faces, right? Like right now, the camera is trained on your face and mine, not our body postures, right? There's no, we're not sampling broadly from the context. We're really just focused on the face. And as perceivers, that's what we do. Our attention is drawn to a face. But we all know that the brain is very sensitive to information, even when a person is not aware of that information. So you, as a perceiver, are taking in all sorts of information about this situation, most of which you're really not aware of. And it turns out that a lot of that information influences your perceptions of emotion. So the context really influences in ways that are mostly unbeknownst to the perceiver, influences the perception that the perceiver has about what the mental state is that the person is experiencing. I think also there's a lot of evidence showing that expressions are often used for communicative purposes. So it's very rare that people, for example, when they're watching movies by themselves, make facial movements. But if you put two people together, all of a sudden, there's more laughing and grimacing and so on and so forth. So I think that perceptions of emotion, it feels to us like all we're doing is watching an expression. But that ease with which we construct perceptions betrays the complexity of what's really going on.
Well, it's interesting you talked about, the social nature of our emotions, and the way in which we sort of amplify our emotion expressions when we're around others. And this reminds me of some work that you've done really illuminating, insights into the importance of, social factors relevant to emotion. So you've done work looking at social network size and even the role of gossip, and playing a really important social function. So I'd love to just conclude by having you talk a little bit about this. I mean, it's relevant to understanding what is an emotion when we think about emotions as centrally involving our interactions with and relationships with other people.
Well, Um, if it's the case that there are these basic operations that are important for constructing emotions, as well as a host of other kinds of mental states, then it follows naturally that some of the processes that we thought were very specific to emotion are really not. For example, so if you look at the regions of the brain that people traditionally think of as being important for emotion, some of them turn out to be important for many, many, many kinds of mental states. So, for example, the amygdala is one of these structures where first people thought the amygdala was specific for fear. When neurons in your amygdala fire, you feel fear or you're able to perceive fear in others. Then there was research showing that in fact the amygdala responds to all kinds of negative states. And then it was discovered that the amygdala also responds to positive states. And then it was discovered that actually the amygdala responds in novelty. If you just present something novel to someone like a face they've never seen before, you get an amygdala response, really robust amygdala response. When I was reading, I'm really a fan of neuroanatomy. I know that sounds like an odd thing to say, but I like to read anatomy papers. And I was reading this comparative neuroanatomy work on social networks and the brain systems that support social networks in primates. And I discovered that so researchers had done these very clever analyses where they looked across species of primates and they measured the grooming size of the primate, and then they measured various the size of various brain structures, adjusting for intracranial volume and body size and so on. And there's this very robust relationship between the size of the amygdala and certain of its projections. And social network size, for species. So I thought, wow, the amygdala, that's supposed to be, I was just new to this, cognitive neuroscience stuff. So I thought, wow, the amygdala, I thought that was supposed to be specific for affect. And I thought, well, I'm running all these imaging studies, where we're targeting actually the amygdala. I could just throw in a measure of social network size because humans vary quite dramatically in their social network size. And no one really up to this point had done, first of all, any studies of humans. And second of all, they were looking at social network size tends to be specific more or less for a species, right? So here I was looking within a species, looking at variation. And it was a very simple hypothesis that individuals with social networks that were very large and very complex perhaps would have a larger amygdala and stronger connections between the amygdala and other brain regions that are important for processing not just emotional information, but social information, because it turns out they're pretty much the same brain regions. If you look in social neuroscience studies and you look in affective neuroscience studies and you look in cognitive neuroscience studies, you see the same patterns of responses in the brain very reliably across different domains. And so we thought this would be a reasonable hypothesis, and in fact it turned out to be quite a robust finding, that individuals who are endowed with a larger amygdala also have this capacity to build and maintain large social networks. Now, of course, we don't really know what the causation is. If you have a bigger amygdala, does that mean that you can build larger networks, or is it the case that if you're exposed to larger numbers of people, that therefore you have some plasticity? And probably it's a little bit of both, as it is with most things in the world. But what's interesting about it is that this suggests that the amygdala is, I think it suggests very clearly what people have suspected for a long time, and that is that the amygdala's job is not really to compute fear or even emotion, that it has a more basic job, that its job really is to alert the rest of the processing capacity in other parts of the brain that a piece of information is salient or important or deserves additional attention. And so you can imagine how this might work in building a social network, right? That you're faced with someone new that you've never seen before, and your job is to quickly learn and figure out, is this friend or foe? Is this person someone I need to remember? Are they going to be important to my well-being in some way? That's really, I think, what's going on here. But it was for us, a really exciting finding. Nobody had really entered this into this domain before, so it was very cool.
Very cool finding indeed. I mean, and when you think about sort of all the work you see happening in the field of emotion, a lot of which you've spearheaded and really shaped the way many people are doing research, nowadays, where do you see the future of the field headed? Sort of, what are the next steps that you see as important to take?
Well, I think that there's a lot of really exciting research that is going on. I think asking someone to predict the future.
Sorry.
But I think if we can use other fields, other domains of science as a guide, then I think one really important direction is to get a little bit more mechanistic. To really try to figure out what are the processes that allow us to have emotional states that are so varied and that are so functional. If once we know what those processes are, then we can set about the business of improving people's lives. But I think we know a lot about the functions of emotion. We don't know very much about how emotions achieve those functions. And to know that, we have to know something about how they're caused.
Absolutely. And I mean, what's interesting when we think about the future, I mean, one, we don't have sort of, a crystal ball to say where it's going to go. So it is a hard question, but I think you point out some really important steps that we need to be thinking about in terms of mechanistic approaches. Another thing when I think of the future is who's going to be leading a lot of it, and it's the students of today, right? And so when you think about students who are just thinking of embarking on the study of emotion, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, the advice I give my own students is trust your gut. Mm-hmm. Like if something makes a lot of sense to you, you should stop and examine that. Because it probably means that whatever you're reading is matching some deeply held belief that you have. And what we do in science is we take deeply held beliefs and then we treat them like hypotheses and we test them, right? Mm-hmm. Similarly, if you read something and you think, that is nuts, there's no way that could be true, again, what you're reading is somehow deeply violating some deeply held belief that you have. And again, you should really examine that. Either examine it by reading or examine it by actually conducting experiments to test it. But I guess your own gut feeling is a good indicator of what you find compelling in one way or another. I think the second piece of advice I would give is don't be so quick to dismiss something that's puzzling to you that no one else seems to see. I think one of the greatest gifts really for a scientist is the ability to notice things, notice phenomena that other people don't see, or to see puzzles where other people don't see them. And just because nobody has written about something or said something before, just because nobody's run an experiment on something before doesn't mean that it's not a valuable domain to be probing. And the third piece of advice I'll say is read broadly. Read broadly. Do not just read psychology. Read history, read philosophy, definitely read philosophy. But, read in other sciences. I think reading broadly beyond the domains of your own science makes you a better scientist. And my final thing I'll say, and this is very controversial, read method sections and results sections. If you really must read a discussion section, knock yourself out. But do not be a passive reader. Do not accept the conclusions of an author without examining the assumptions and the methods yourself. So what I mean by that is, I'm not suggesting to students to be argumentative, but what I am saying is be an active reader. Do not be a consumer. You can be a consumer of science writing in physics or in chemistry because that's not your expertise. But when you're reading scientific papers in your own discipline, you must be an active reader. And if you take that stance, you will have a very, enjoyable, productive, and challenging career.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for speaking with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for including me in your series.
And with that, this concludes our Experts in Emotion interview series with Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett from Northeastern University.